And it's so difficult for them to actually come up through the physical sciences to determine this. The only reason why they can come up with this is they have to come up with this because they don't relegate themselves to understanding the universe in any other way. They don't allow themselves to see the possibility that knowledge and information could be passed on through anything other than the physical laws of the universe and the physical matter, which, by the way, were created within the Big Bang too, because the physical laws had to be laid down as the Big Bang happened. You get concepts like dimensions and everything else, because before that point in time, in terms of singularity, you have, all the physical laws of the universe basically mesh into this complete everything and nothing concept of whatever existed before the Big Bang. So that's the problem with science, and that's the problem with atheism today. Science attempts, the best way I can put this is science attempts to answer the question of how, but it doesn't answer the question of why. Because why would suggest a design element to it, would suggest knowledge, it would suggest forethought, it would suggest there's a direction that's put there with a purpose. It suggests purpose. How doesn't really go into that. In other words, I can explain how a car works, I can explain how an airplane works, but I can't explain why an airplane works. When the Wright brothers got together, the reason why they built the airplane is they wanted to figure out how to fly, and that was an intelligent decision on their part. You can explain how it works in terms of, okay, this wire affects this flap here, which affects the wind current, and the engine has a propeller in the front as opposed that spins in order to corkscrew through the air and create air mass that flows underneath the wings and gives it lift, etc., etc. So you can explain the functionality of it, but it never explains why. You can explain the causality of it. In other words, you can say that because air flows underneath the wing, it pushes the aircraft up. That's a causality argument, but that's not the same as why, because why is a philosophical and religious argument. And science never answers the question of the philosophical and religious argument. And atheism and existentialism basically reject that concept altogether. They just say it's just so, it just is. Well, I look around at all this nature in the world, and I have a very hard time saying it's just is. But more importantly, you have to recognize that when they say that, that's a point of faith, because it goes back to those first concepts that I was talking about to begin with, which is God is or God is not. So for them to say it just is, this existential argument, that the world is the way it is just because, and there's no purpose or design behind it, or no greater power that set these things into motion, that is a point of faith, because by their own definition, they cannot determine that God is or is not via their natural means. So therefore, for them to lay the claim that God is not, that everything is just is, and that to deny the purpose is to pluck out their spiritual eyes, if you will. They lay themselves blind because they only see things according to the natural world, according to their idol, if you will. Whereas, in my opinion, the religious world, the ones that believe that God is, accept the fact and see with spiritual eyes, if you will, the fact that there is a higher power at work that creates all of this. And in that sense, what we're really arguing here between atheism and Christianity, and particularly within the sciences, is we're arguing points of faith. Because in the sciences go beyond taking a question of how things happen. They actually take the position of why things happen when they begin with. They have to take a position of faith long before they enter into the scientific method, because they have to begin the scientific method from a point of skepticism. In other words, if they cannot define the universe by a physical method, they have to reject it from the get-go. So they take the standpoint of God is not until proven otherwise by physical methods, which they'll never get. So therefore, because they'll never get it via physical means, they'll never be able to say God is, therefore God is not. Well, that's a point of faith. That's not a point of science. But if they build everything on that foundation that God is not, then they have to fit all the facts and all the arguments and all the data that comes in afterwards on that foundation, and it has to fit it, which is why you get things like evolution and the cosmology of the old universe, etc., today, because it's all built on that starting point of faith. And the best example of that I can see is you go back and you look at how these concepts began with Darwinism and the geological column, etc., etc. These concepts started with people who were denying God from a point of faith, and then adding this data into it. I mean, the person that developed the geological column was a railroad guy. Darwin started out as a member of the clergy who fell away from his faith, and then began to develop this concept of evolution. So, and the same thing happens with communism. I mean, if you look at the political philosophical ideals, communism was started by Karl Marx, who basically hated Christianity. And you can read about that in his biography. He hated religion, and so therefore he created a system, a political economic system, that denied religion, calling it the opiate of the masses and so forth. But he did recognize that there was the need for some sort of religious edict, so he came up with the idea of the state replacing religion. But again, they start with these concepts, these points of faith, and then they build their foundation and their worldview upon it. And so therefore, it's in a sense, it's garbage in, garbage out, because if you start from a point of faith, you're going to come up with the data and the conclusions to support those ideas after the fact. And it becomes very inbred in a sense, which is the problem with creation science not being allowed, because it's almost like an antitrust issue, or having a monopoly over a certain set of ideas. When you don't allow creationism to explore these different concepts, what you're doing is you're inbreeding our university and our intellectual and academic system to only come to one conclusion always. But it's already kind of built into it anyway, because they have to deny God from the get-go in the scientific method. So anyways, that's my point, is that they're both starting from a position of faith, and then they're coming up with conclusions and facts to meet their viewpoint after the fact. That's why you can sit there and you can argue like crazy that I believe that the Democratic Party is the best, has the best policies, or the other person could believe that that the Republican Party has the best policies. Once they take an identity position of saying they're a Democrat or Republican, all of their data and their information is going to meet their arguments after the fact. So it's going to be very difficult to sway them one way or the other based on data alone. That's why collecting facts in the sciences doesn't really resolve this issue, because all you're doing is you're continuing to collect weapons to defend your viewpoint, which is where the sciences are going right now. And that's why we're in the situation we are with atheism versus evolution versus creationism and Christianity, etc., etc. Okay, so that's my point, is that they're both starting from a point of faith. But the second point I want to make on this is that really, in terms of their point of faith, what they're arguing about is not whether or not there's a God, but they're arguing about what are the attributes of God. And if you look in the Old Testament, the Jewish culture had a lot of different names for God. They called him Adonai, which means the Lord, talking about the character of God in position of lordship. They called him Shaddai, which means Almighty, meaning that he was all-powerful God. They called him HaKodesh, which is the Holy One, meaning that God is holy. They called him Jehovah Jireh, which means God the Provider. So they began to use names for God that would define the attributes of God. And in a sense, that's what this whole argument between atheism and Christianity and monotheism and everything else in the world is today, is it's